This video is brought to you by me and my freshly launched sticker shop, Digital Ghetto. This is something I've been working on for the last few months. All the designs are by me, I'm shipping all the orders myself, and while it's really not all that related to what I do here on YouTube, think of it as my version of merch or a Patreon. You can check it out at shop.digitalghetto.net, link in the description. When PS5 Pro was finally officially announced in September, it was controversial to say the least. The mission statement of PS5 Pro, while poorly communicated and demonstrated by Sony, is simple. Play PS5 games with no compromises, meaning combine the visual fidelity of 30 FPS graphics mode with the performance of 60 FPS mode, which typically has massive resolution and settings trade-offs. To achieve this, they've beefed up the GPU and added in more robust ray tracing capabilities and a machine learning upscaler that aims to replace software-based solutions like FSR2. While it is currently marred by some embarrassingly poor third-party game updates, at its best in first and second-party games, it is a capable piece of hardware that I feel provides a tangible and at times transformative improvement over the now base PS5. I'm going to go more in depth on that in a minute, but I think it's important to recognize that the divisive reactions this thing elicited at its announcement had little to do with its capabilities. It's the perceived value of those capabilities, not just relative to price, but in general, as well as what the existence of this system implies for the current state and direction going forward for console gaming. Even before it was officially revealed, I've seen so many arguments and viewpoints arise from this console's existence, virtually none of them having to do with the quality of the product itself, but rather everything that's surrounding it. The lack of PS5 games, the inability for its benefits to be communicated visually or verbally to the masses, and of course, the price, which doesn't include a vertical stand or Blu-ray drive. All of this paints a picture that is much larger than just this console and invites a lot of discussion. I find myself understanding or even agreeing with almost all of the takes I've seen across the spectrum, from its price being offensively tone-deaf in an inflation-ridden world where debt and unemployment are high, all the way to the flip side where some argue it's pretty normally priced compared to other tech products and could even be considered a decent value since it will be the highest-end console for at least the next 3 years. Some will say if you want a high-end experience, you should really be looking at a PC, which is not wrong, but a $700 PC, while capable, is not going to be ideal for a 4K TV. Some will suggest that the extra fidelity and performance provided by the Pro is not relevant to them or others, and while the unrelenting success of something like the Switch proves that is likely the case, there's one argument I can't get behind, and it's this increasingly popular notion I've seen that games aren't about games anymore, it's all tech and they're too focused on graphics. There is a legitimate critique to be made about a game like Horizon Forbidden West, which achieved some of the most impressive visuals ever, but is offensively boring in just about every other aspect. But games have always focused on tech. The two are inextricably intertwined. It's the basis for the medium. It would be like saying film is too focused on cameras or cinematography. The race for better hardware and more impressive visuals and techniques has been there since day one. All these previous eras that are now looked back upon as being soulful were just as, if not more tech-focused than what we get now. The PS2 was a technical breakthrough that Sony reveled in. The original Xbox was literally conceived to be more powerful than the PS2 and GameCube, and the Xbox 360 and PS3 was the last time we really saw a tech arms race in the gaming industry. Games like Mario 64 and MGS2, which I don't think anyone would describe as being too focused on tech today, were tech showcases of their time. They also happen to be fantastically designed games, but the idea that being tech-forward or even tech-focused equates to a bad or soulless, boring game is just not true, and when I see some of these takes, I sense a certain ignorance or misunderstanding of the industry. What exactly is this amorphous concept of tech anyway? For a lot of people, it seems to mean graphics or power, which are aspects of the equation, but they're not everything. Nintendo is a great example of this. They're not pushing cutting-edge graphics or powerful hardware, but they've experimented with hardware in ways that no one else does, and with their software, I'd argue they're one of the most technically competent names in the industry. Since GameCube, they stopped focusing on power entirely, but the Wii's motion controls, the Switch concept, and even the Wii U gamepad are technological innovations. Their first-party games have an unparalleled level of polish, almost always staying locked at their target frame rate. Tears of the Kingdom looks graphically the same as a 2017 game, but I would describe it as technically ambitious. It heavily utilizes complex systems and physics, and likely required a ton of testing to keep it from falling apart at the seams. Even in glossy AAA games that conform to the more mainstream perception of tech-heavy, I can name plenty of examples like Cyberpunk, Alan Wake, and Dead Space where the high-end presentation not only didn't detract from the game, but made them what they are. Technique and technical skill aren't everything in any medium. That's definitely a trap to fall into, but they certainly are something. They're like the building blocks upon which anything creative is constructed. Now, I'm not suggesting that I'm a hardware-software genius or that you have to be one to properly get video games, but once you reach a certain level of engagement with them, being a complete layman, especially intentionally so, is certainly going to be a hindrance. Even on a surface level, without intentionally researching it, you're bound to interact with it given the nature of what video games are. It would be like being a cinephile and saying you don't care about shot composition, or being a big reader and shrugging off writing style. Once you interact with this stuff enough, I think you intuitively understand it to some degree, and it helps you navigate the medium. The only reason I care about this stuff and know anything about it is solely because I want to play games in the best way possible, and that's why I took an interest in PS5 Pro to begin with, but it's also become an interesting case study in the public's perception of tech in games. The ignorance can go both ways. You've got people looking at compressed 1080p YouTube videos saying this thing is useless, it does nothing, and then you have the crowd that just blindly believes anything played on it automatically looks better, like PS4 games or games which receive no performance or resolution enhancements when played on Pro. Performance on PS5 has become a genuine issue in the last 2 years though, and that combined with the contentious nature of this console made me want to pick one up and see not only if it can provide a better experience, but if it can justify its own existence. Given the extended preamble and all the lore surrounding this product, there's a lot about it that's pretty straightforward. Starting with the actual hardware design, it's essentially just the PS5 Slim design slightly extended with some fish skills on the side. When I first saw the design, I assumed that this was done so the two models could share parts to reduce cost and simplify logistics, and while this proudly diskless console is compatible with the same disk drive as the Slim as well as the stand, bafflingly, only the lower plates of the Slim fit on the Pro. They appear to have intentionally added extra prongs to the Pro that make the top ones not fit. I can't imagine why they would do that, but now we'll have to wait to get a third SKU of replacement plates. As someone who generally likes the design of the PS5 Slim, save for the awkward acrylic prop rod for horizontal use, which makes a return here, this is just a slightly uglier version of that. The biggest compliment I can give is that it's much smaller and lighter than I imagined. Next to the original PS5, it's a solid 20 to 30% smaller and weighs like a kilo less, which is impressive for a unit that's significantly more powerful. Also impressive is the efficiency. According to the manual, it's rated for 390 watts peak, compared to the original PS5, which was 350. Overall, it's not a beautiful design like the original PS2 or PS4, but it'll be easier to integrate into a setup than the original behemoth PS5, which is likely what most people buying the Pro will be upgrading from. The only complaint I have is that the lack of a horizontal stand allows it to easily slide around when pressing the front buttons or plugging in a cable. Since I'm an evil, earth-hating disc lover not ready for the future, I of course had to buy the $80 disc drive, which was at least a little bit fun to install since I've been curious about how it works since the Slim launched. Other than that, I just transferred over saves and the extra M.2 drive from my old PS5, and everything is exactly the same. While I don't think it excuses the lack of a disk drive, they did include 2 terabytes of internal storage here, which is nice. Seeing as this system launched without a single coinciding game, the decision of what to try it out with was mostly freestyling on my part. While Sony's marketing would lead you to believe that you're simply getting a pro mode that gives you 60 FPS with high graphics and PSSR upscaling, what you get varies from game to game, some having multiple new options, and with like 50 games receiving updates, I had to choose my targets. Let's start with something simple that does adhere to the basic promise of the PS5 Pro, The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 Remastered. On PS5, both of these run at 1440p 60 or 4K 30. Pro mode here offers an internal resolution of 1440p upscaled to 4K with PSSR at 60 FPS, making this a perfect taste test for PSSR. Now, in the past year or two, we've started to see console games heavily rely on software-based upscalers, primarily FSR2, to attempt to make a presentable 4K image out of a postage stamp internal resolution. They're pushing FSR far beyond what it was ever intended to do, and that combined with FSR not being so great, has led to games that look blurry, with lots of ghosting and artifacting. PSSR is attempting to rectify that. It's the first of its kind on console, and it's actually new for AMD as well. With this and the RT features, we're getting an advanced look at RDNA 4 GPU features. PSSR is a hardware-accelerated machine learning upscaler in the vein of NVIDIA's lauded DLSS, which is personally how I play just about every game on PC now. Now, with a game like The Last of Us, you might wonder why they bothered with PSSR when they could likely run it at a native 4K 60. But going back and forth between native 4K and PSSR, I think PSSR is doing a better job, and compared to the old 1440p mode, it's a pretty night and day improvement. What's happening here is pretty similar to my experience with DLSS. The perceived resolution is just better than native. Everything, especially small details like hair, are sharper and more detail is revealed. And even more crucially than that, in my opinion, it's replacing TAA, which has been responsible for making games look blurry since the PS4 generation. In motion, PSSR here is super stable and sharp without any ghosting or blur, which is a big part of the reason why it can look better than the native 4K mode. Additionally, with a VRR-capable TV, the 60 FPS cap can be removed, and according to my TV's built-in overlay, I was regularly seeing it go to like 90 in Part 2 and a bit lower in Part 1, which is a heavier game. Now, I'd say all of this, including PSSR, is more of a nice-to-have in these games. I was already very happy with their performance on normal PS5, but what's interesting about this is that it's a pretty similar experience to how I'd play on my high-end PC. I play on my 4K TV with DLSS quality mode, which is 1440p internal, and just let the game run as fast as it can, with VRR smoothing out the experience. Now, it's not all perfect with PSSR, and with such a straightforward game like this that I'm super familiar with, a few things stood out to me. First off, there's this almost film grain-like noise with PSSR. It's going to be hard for me to demonstrate with my poor capture setup, but it's particularly apparent on foliage, and it's something that popped up in most of the games I played. And yes, I have film grain disabled in the settings. It's not a deal breaker. I'd still take the PSSR image over 1440p TAA 10 out of 10 times, but this is not something I've ever noticed with DLSS 2.0 and up. I also feel that The Last of Us games appear slightly over-sharpened, something that I have observed with DLSS in some games. However, The Last of Us games are the only games I noticed that with on PSSR. The final thing I noticed with my first PSSR game is that it's not a free performance enhancer. In fact, it's a bit more expensive than I imagined. With neither of these games pushing the Pro very hard, the uncapped VRR mode allows for direct performance comparisons, and the 1440p PSSR mode is running a good 20 FPS lower compared to 1440p TAA. In these games, it doesn't really matter, but what it does mean is that for more demanding games, the Pro is not always able to brute force its way to good performance and visuals, which I'll discuss later on. Demon's Souls, which is still a true PS5 exclusive, gets a very similar update to The Last of Us, and it felt pretty impactful. When I first played this game at launch, I remember feeling that it was super sharp, but turning it back on to the original performance mode, it's quite blurry actually, and PSSR just totally cleans that up. I think it's a similar situation here, 1440p TAA versus 1440p PSSR, and PSSR just looks way better on a 4K TV. While I still honestly don't understand the commotion around this game, Stellar Blade receives a similarly straightforward PSSR upgrade, but to much more transformative results. There's actually two modes here, one is PSSR and the other is native 4K with TAA. The PSSR mode looks noticeably cleaner than the 4K TAA mode and also runs up to 80 FPS on a VRR display. It's another PC-like experience similar to The Last of Us, but this game looks kind of rough without PSSR, so it's a bigger upgrade. However, I did notice more PSSR shortcomings with this one. This is a very nitpicky shot here, but you can see how the foliage kind of dances and has almost a film grain to it, which goes away in the other modes with TAA. Regardless, it's still vastly better played with PSSR, but there's still room for it to improve, even here in a good implementation. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, this is the big one. I would say this is the closest this console has to a killer app. This game was notoriously marred by poor performance and visuals at launch on base PS5. Before I played this, I had to finish up the final 3 chapters of the first game and the DLC episode, so I was pretty acclimated to how it looks, and once I booted up Rebirth with PSSR on, I was just kind of stunned, even without comparing it to base PS5 settings. Now, I did eventually do that, and oh my god, it's insane how blurry it is in performance mode. It looks like a Switch game, but the Pro just completely fixes it. Even compared to the 30 FPS mode, PSSR is just making this game look so good on a 4K TV, revealing so much detail that was previously obscured, and it's doing it at what feels like a virtually locked 60 FPS. So this is a case where both performance and image quality needed to be fixed, and Pro is delivering a monumentally better experience, which I think, even with the built-in capture footage that I'm using, should be obvious. This game does have a ton of foliage, so the noise dithering thing does make a return, and I also noticed that this game has a slight bit of ghosting compared to the other ones which have very little, but I'm finding it hard to work up many complaints here, because the game just looks and plays so fantastic. This was by far the best game I tried on the Pro, and as soon as I'm done with this review, I'm just going to go right back and play it to the end. While not without its issues, which are expected for a 1.0 implementation of a machine learning upscaler, PSSR does a commendable job in every game I just discussed. However, that's not universally the case, and as updates have slowly trickled out, a lot of third-party stuff, especially Unreal games, are just as bad as they were on PS5, or actually worse in some cases. From what I've heard, Bloober defied the odds and managed to pull a gem out of their ass somehow with Silent Hill 2, but I guess I'm going to be waiting a bit longer to verify that because the situation is a mess on the Pro. There was some mystery surrounding the Pro patch for this game, but it turned out that it had indeed been patched with PSSR, and it kind of ruined the game. It looks awful, half the elements on screen are shimmering, really dancing actually, James is a dithered mess, tons of ghosting, and it felt like it wasn't hitting 60 FPS in its performance mode, though the quality mode looked just as bad. Bloober's solution? Patch the game again and remove PSSR and re-enable TSR. So at this point, I don't really think it's an upgrade over base PS5, but at least it's not a downgrade anymore. Unfortunately, this is not an isolated case. Other games like Alan Wake 2 and Star Wars Outlaws are straight up worse on the Pro, which is just not acceptable. What seems to be happening here is that the internal resolutions that these games are upscaling from are just way too low, and PSSR cannot cope with it. All the good implementations I tried are mostly upscaling from 1440p, while some of these other games are below 1080p. Again, this is a machine learning upscaler. It can be improved with patches as they improve the model, but more can and should be done, like right now. While I do feel the blame here ultimately lies on the developers who thought these patches were acceptable to ship, Sony should have a more hands-on role here with these developers, because this is doing a ton of damage. Pre-2.0 DLSS was trained on a per-game basis with NVIDIA collaboration. I don't think it's a coincidence that first and second-party games almost universally have good PSSR implementations, while third-party games are struggling. Third-party developers are using lower resolutions, different engines, different techniques, and with Sony presumably training PSSR with PlayStation Studio games, there's probably some glaring blind spots in the model. I also think Sony should take a more proactive approach when they inevitably start iterating on PSSR. I somehow doubt that PSSR will be updated system-wide and will instead need to be updated on the developer side. A good solution here could be to leave the game as the developer left it, but have a toggle in the system settings that allows the user to force the latest version of PSSR. PSSR is not magic, it has limits, it has a lot of room to grow, it can be used improperly by the developer, and it does have a notable performance impact. It took DLSS until 2.0 to really be viable and good, and I think when used properly, this is already better than pre-2.0 DLSS. This is quite obviously going to be something that Sony sticks with and will likely be used more universally by the time PS6 rolls around. Getting something like this off the ground is always going to have growing pains, and while I am impressed with it in many games, there should just never be a time when the more expensive product makes something worse than the cheaper one. While PSSR combined with extra horsepower for 60 plus FPS is clearly the reason why you'd buy a Pro, Sony also touted its enhanced ray tracing capabilities. To me, this is far less interesting and nowhere near what Nvidia is doing on PC, so I just tried out 2 games that went harder on RT features. The ever-fastidious Insomniac have updated all 4 of their PS5 games to take advantage of PSSR, along with improved RT support. I decided to check out Spider Mid 2, as I call it, seeing as it's the newest game and appears to have received the most robust updates. When this game came out, I actually played it with the 40 FPS mode, because the cuts in the 60 FPS mode were just too severe for me, so right off the bat, going to 60 plus with Pro is a big upgrade. The upgrade options with the Pro patch are vast, possibly too vast for a console. Insomniac seems to have taken the Pro name too seriously. Now I could sit here and really dig into the specifics of what they're doing with these RT features, which are genuinely impressive for a console, but the reality is that from my perspective, I don't think any of it is really making a huge impact on my enjoyment of the game. 60 FPS with sharp image quality, yes, but this game was clearly not developed from the ground up with these extensive RT features in mind, so it feels more like a PC game from 5 years ago rather than a cutting-edge PC game from today. Polyphony Digital has always been a studio known for pushing boundaries with tech on console, and they're hitting us with a few features here. This game has an 8K mode, which, from what I understand, upscales from 4K to 8K with PSSR. I don't have an 8K TV, no one really does, that's like CES gimmick stuff, and also a bit funny because the launch PS5 box had an 8K badge on it while the Pro doesn't. But really, the main upgrades here are ray tracing and PSSR. Ray tracing was actually already in the game, but only in replays, so now we're seeing it in real-time gameplay. It's limited to car body panels, which is actually fine because that's basically the only thing that's in focus when you're playing, and it looks great. PSSR is not at its best in this game though. That was something I noticed immediately. The entire frame exhibits the film grain noise shimmering thing, which is really noticeable when pausing in replays, and there's even breakup and artifacting happening on the cars. Just look at the parking sensors on this GR Yaris. Looking really clean and sharp is, I think, the visual style of this game, and it achieved that even on base PS5, and here with PSSR, it just looks a lot less sharp and clean. Now, you can still run RT without PSSR, but it disables RT in first person inside the car, so you can just leave it off and enjoy pristine visuals unless you're playing in cockpit mode. In a game like Spider-Man 2, adding RT reflections is more of a nice to have, but in a racing game, I think it actually is the next step in visual fidelity. Seeing the taillights of a car bouncing off its own bumper, seeing cars reflect off one another side by side, and seeing accurate reflections of the track itself really helps to elevate the already hyper-detailed models and paintwork that was already in the game. On the base PS5, RT support was typically relegated to somewhat gimmicky modes that sacrificed so much to implement very limited RT features that were clearly not worth the cost. On the Pro, RT can be used more liberally while maintaining 60 FPS, but without what Nvidia is doing with ray reconstruction, frame generation, and just way more horsepower, it's still to me a small additive feature here, rather than something which can transform the identity of a game. Then let's quickly talk about more passive things that the Pro enables. PS5 games that did not receive a patch are still able to access some level of the Pro's extra power, which, for some games, enables a superior experience. For example, Astrobot does not have a patch, but it does use dynamic resolution scaling, so with the Pro, it's presumably going to be hitting 4K more often, if not the entire time, while other games that didn't consistently hit their frame rate target will be smoothed out on the Pro. Then there's this very bizarre toggle hidden within the settings menu called Enhance Image Quality for PS4 games. If you're hoping for Bloodborne in 4K, you're going to be disappointed because this is not that at all. It's some kind of filter being applied to the game after the fact, rather than something which is plugging into the game as part of the rendering pipeline. In other words, this is not PSSR support for PS4 games. However, I'd have to assume that there is some kind of machine learning component to it, since they decided to ship this feature now with the Pro only. I'd say this is only slightly elevated over something like those gimmick gamer HDMI cables that are just applying sharpening. Like others have noted, it does a decent job with 2D art like UI elements, but even with that there's limits. A lot of stuff gets that posterized effect if you really focus in on it. In general, I would say it is improving overall clarity, but with the games I tried, Drive Club and Bloodborne, it kind of also accentuates existing flaws. This filter only works with games that don't have PS4 Pro patches, so 1080p and lower, and with these games, they already had a lot of aliasing, and now with the over-sharpening of this filter, they shimmer in a way that I find pretty distracting. I think it's cool that they tried to do something for these games which are stuck at low resolutions and look bad on a modern 4K TV, but based on the limited time I spent here, I can't say I'm super impressed by the results. While the actual performance results of the hardware from game to game were a lot less straightforward than I expected going into this, the biggest problem here is still exactly what I anticipated. This is a product made for a nearly non-existent demographic. Of course, there's the PlayStation diehards and people who just generally buy whatever the most expensive thing is, but you don't engineer an entire console for those people. So I think this is targeted at someone who has a high-end, VRR-capable display and is a serious tech and game enthusiast who is perceptive and demanding enough to want more passable image quality on their high-end display with a higher or more stable frame rate. That represents a very small portion of players, and those people who are looking for the uncompromised high-end experience regardless of price, they're already on PC, where, barring exclusivity and bad ports, they're getting an experience which can scale way past PS5 Pro. So we're looking at two even more specific types of people. Someone who cares about all that, has the nice TV, but for whatever reason doesn't want to step into the PC world. For that slim sliver of people for whom this would make sense as a primary gaming device, it's absolutely inadvisable right now because of the shoddy third-party support. So then you're left with one true demographic, me, someone who wants to play the best version of the game no matter the platform or cost, a multi-platform enthusiast. If I were to put on my blinders for this review, it achieves exactly what I wanted from it. Games which are currently playable only on PS5 are, for the most part, running at a consistent 60 FPS and upscaling to 4K very cleanly, which makes the times I do use my PS5 feel like less of a downgraded experience compared to PC. But even for someone like me, that value hinges upon your patience. As we all know, there are not a lot of PS5 games, and the ones that do exist are being ported over to PC with an increasingly shorter lag time. My highlight game on the Pro, FF7 Rebirth, is now coming to PC with DLSS, which, despite it being a strong PSSR showing, will automatically look better than PS5 Pro unless Square really botches the port. The only game I talked about in this entire video which is not likely to make its way over to PC anytime soon is Demon's Souls. So the thing that it does do really well, it only has a 1 to 2 year window to be uniquely the best at. All of this is further amplified by the price, which is inarguably the biggest sore spot. $700 in the US and even more everywhere else, with no disk drive included. For me, it's really the last part that makes it feel like an offensive price. The Blu-ray drive itself is almost certainly of negligible cost to Sony, and the kind of person who would buy this system is probably upgrading from a launch PS5 where they already have a physical games library, making this an $80 tax. It's also spiritually insulting, especially when a SKU of PS5 Slim still ships with the drive, and it pushes the price up to the point where maybe the just build a PC crowd has a point. To be clear, an $800 PC is just not the move for 4K AAA gaming, and while it would be capable of doing some things that a console cannot, you're looking at a 1080p class GPU for that budget. However, I think that for the narrow audience that would consider the Pro, a $1,200 to $1,500 PC is not totally out of the question. For that price, you're looking at a 4070 or soon 5070, which is the point at which I would say PC becomes a better and more flexible option. Yes, you'll have to contend with some awkwardness in terms of integrating it into the living room as well as configuring settings, but if you really care about getting a premium experience, I think it's worth it. You're not beholden to the constraints of some of these patches or the growing pains of PSSR, specifically in third-party games. Historically, I haven't been a fan of comparing consoles to PC, as their price points and roles were pretty far apart, but the concept of consoles and their value has started to erode lately. Some people are offended by the concept of a mid-cycle refresh. It does go against the traditional concept of the console, which is quite egalitarian in nature, a fixed platform that persists throughout an entire generation. Personally, I don't love it, but last gen, it was mostly just offering more resolution, and if you didn't have a 4K TV or just didn't care, it was whatever. That's not the case this gen, and hardware is having to step in and fix software in ways that it shouldn't. As a mid-cycle refresh, PS5 Pro is not really enabling any new experiences, which is fine. PS4 Pro didn't either, but the difference is that PS4 Pro was very consistent in what it did. PS5 Pro can be pretty wildly inconsistent with its patches, and that combined with sometimes complicated and poorly communicated settings menus makes me feel like we're losing the plot when it comes to the console experience, which to me should be curated and foolproof. Microsoft has no answer to the Pro. They've already seeded this generation, but with Sony having a head start with their upscaler, they're looking at a pretty difficult battle next gen if they want to compete traditionally. Sony has no direct competition now, we're in very uncharted territory, and it raises legitimate concerns for PS6 pricing. It's becoming super expensive to have a competent gaming experience, both on console and PC, and people are rightfully mad about that. In that sense, PS5 Pro is really nothing unique, and just became the straw that broke the camel's back regarding the public's perception of the industry. Dramatically raising prices while cutting previously expected features, and then selling those features back to you for more money. Poorly QA'd software that performs inexcusably badly, less competition leading to less interesting products and creative works, and an increasingly homogenized, siloed industry that feels like it's becoming smaller despite the quarterly earnings breaking records. There are a lot of interesting things about PS5 Pro. It gives us a glimpse into what PS6 will be like, the physical hardware package is pretty impressive, and I genuinely loved what it was capable of doing for properly patched games, and I'm excited to see how it's utilized by future games like Death Stranding 2 and GTA 6, which is why I wanted the system. Mark Cerny's head was absolutely in the right place when he conceived this console, apparently right after PS5 launched. Raw internal resolution is just not really relevant anymore. It's about perceived image quality, and ML-based upscalers are the way to get there. By introducing this as a mid-gen upgrade, they're getting ahead of the curve. Hardware-accelerated ray tracing, while still mostly an additive feature here rather than a core one, will also be something that's fundamental to the makeup of games by the time PS6 comes out. And most importantly for me personally, this console signals a commitment to 60 FPS being a standard rather than an option. At the beginning of this gen, almost everything was shipping with a 60 FPS mode, and that was almost always the way to play. More recently, that's been slipping, usually by way of extreme compromises in those modes. I really hope that this means that by the time PS6 rolls around, 30 FPS can be relegated to antiquity. The hardware here is mostly the right choice, I think, let down by the price, for sure, but that's just the reality we live in. Tech is an issue here, though, but it's on the software side. These third-party, mostly Unreal Engine games are just glaringly bad, not only on Pro but in general. Bafflingly bad performance and just decisions in general are so prominent right now. Looking at some of the Pro patches I didn't personally try, I just can't understand how anyone could be involved in the process of creating them and think it's okay to ship. Whether it's due to a lack of care, budget, or ability on the developer side is unclear to me, but technical excellence has really slipped in the industry, and I would argue that overall, there's not enough focus on tech in games today, despite the popular sentiment being the opposite. None of this is PS5 Pro's fault technically, but the reality is that hardware is judged by its software experiences, and right now, the flaws are just too many too often, and the optics are not great. As much nuance as there is to get into with this thing, I'm really struggling to theorycraft the person who this system makes sense for, and I don't think I could look anybody in the face and seriously recommend that they invest $700 to $800 in this as a primary gaming device. It just doesn't make sense.